Hey everybody, this is Franco, and I often get a lot of questions about soldering. Something that I don't know, I don't want to say that I take it for granted, but I don't talk in detail about it. But occasionally people will say, hey, how do you solder? Or I wish I could solder like you. So I thought I'd shoot a video about it. So soldering is something that my dad actually taught me how to do it when I was a kid, and I've been doing it for a long time. But I only recently think I kind of figured it out, and I'll tell you what happened. My whole life soldering, one time I would sit down and I would solder, and everything would go great, and I'd be really happy. Then maybe I'd come out again a week later, and I'd go to solder something, and nothing would work. It wouldn't, the solder wouldn't stick, and I'd get really frustrated. So, throughout the years, I would buy different soldering irons because I thought maybe I had a cheap soldering iron. But that didn't really seem to solve the problem, so I just kind of suffered through it. But lately, maybe the last year or two, I figured out what I was doing wrong. So I thought I would go through some of that with you and hopefully help you guys if you're looking to improve your soldering skills. Hopefully this will do the trick. So what do you need? There's a couple of things that you need. The first thing, if you're going to solder, you're probably going to be soldering wire. So there's different types of wire. A lot of times you'll be soldering, this is, what is this, 22 gauge stranded wire. So you can see the wire is not solid, it's stranded. This is pretty typical stuff, and this stranded wire, 22 gauge, is very common. Actually, this is 20 gauge. Actually, I lied to you. This is 20 gauge. The bigger the number, the smaller the wire. The smaller the number, the bigger the wire. So 12 gauge wire is thicker than 20 gauge wire, and so on and so forth. Anyway, the stranded wire, this is good where things are going to be flexing, right? So if you're going to be making something that moves all the time, like maybe wires that are going out to the end of your CNC machine where the table's moving all the time, well, then you want to use the stranded wire. That's the stuff you want to use. The other type of wire that you're going to see is solid wire, right? So this stuff, it's not stranded, it's just one solid piece of metal, and you can see it's not nearly as flexible. You bend it, it kind of holds its shape. So you would not want to use this wire in an application where things are moving all the time, because if you do this enough times with a solid core wire, it's going to break. So things that move, you want to use stranded wire. If you're just working inside your electrical enclosure where you're just hooking things up, they're not going to move, you can use the solid core wire. And I'll be honest with you, I prefer to use the solid core wire whenever possible. I think it's a little easier to work with, but when you're doing things that move, you use the stranded. So there's the wire. And okay, so you have to have wire. What else do you need to have? You have to have some means of cutting the wire, right? So a wire snipper. And you don't need anything fancy. I have an actual, pretty cheap one here from Home Depot. But you just need some way of cutting your wire, and this is how you do it. So you need some kind of wire cutter. Once you cut the wire, you have to be able to strip the ends, so you need some kind of tool to strip it. I have this old, I worked at the factory that made these things years ago, and this is an amp champ tool. I doubt you can find one made in USA anymore, but back when I was there, they were making them in the USA. But this is just a very simple wire stripper, and it has the different gauge wires listed on it. And you just drop your wire in there, and you squeeze it, and you strip the wire. You get a nice stripped end. There's also fancier things. Now I have a really old one. My wife found this in a house that she bought, and I claimed it. But this is like an automatic wire stripper. And these things are okay. And the way this works is you drop the wire in, it squeezes it, and then as you do this, it just pulls that off, right? I actually don't really like these types of wire strippers. I'm sure the newer ones are better. I find them to be a little cumbersome. I don't really use this thing, but that's kind of the idea. I'm not going to use this today. We're going to get rid of that. So, okay. back to the standard wire stripper. What else do you need? Talked about the wire, the cutter, the stripper, the soldering iron. That's very important. So you don't have to have a really expensive soldering iron, but you do have to have one that works. And there's different wattages of soldering iron. So this blue one that I have right here, this is, what is this? This is a 30 watt. This is a 30 watt soldering iron. And Benzomatic brand. I bought this at Home Depot. I think it was probably around $15. But this 30 watt soldering iron, this is pretty good. What else do I have? I have this one here. This came from Radio Shack. This is I believe a 60 watt soldering iron. And then over here, I have a really cheap soldering iron. This is a dual wattage soldering iron, so I can switch it from 15 watts to 30 watts. You can see there's a switch right there on it. So for all intents and purposes, I have a 15 watt iron, I have a 30 watt iron, and I have a 60 watt iron. So why do you need different wattages? Well, if you're soldering really fine things, you use less wattage. If you're soldering really big heavy wires with big thick terminal connectors, you need more wattage. And something you have to remember is the wire and the connectors, they actually work like heat sinks, right? So you may start out okay, the first, you're tinning a wire and it melts the solder, but then when you go to put it inside of a connector, all of a sudden you can't melt the solder anymore because that additional metal is dissipating the heat. So that's why I have this big 60 watt soldering iron when I'm doing really thick wires with electrical connectors, like for RC cars and things like that. You need the big iron. When you're doing little fine stuff, detail stuff, you use the 15 watt iron. If I had to buy one, if I just had to get one soldering iron, I'd probably go buy this 30 watt soldering iron because it seems to work great for most of the stuff that I do. All right, what else do you need? You should get some of this stuff. And this was the secret that helped improve my soldering game considerably. This stuff is called tip tinner and cleaner. And my dad taught me how to solder, but he never told me about this stuff. What this does is it cleans the tip of the soldering iron. It looks like kind of like chalky hard candy, but let me show you what it does. So this soldering iron's warmed up. I have it at 15 watts right now, so should be warm enough to do this. But what you do is you take the soldering iron and you sort of push it into this stuff. And the heat of the soldering iron actually melts it. What that does is I don't know if it's like an acid or what it is, but it kind of like etches and cleans the tip of your soldering iron. And that was always a problem for me. I found that what was happening is, some days I would be able to solder okay, it would go great, other days I wouldn't. It was because of the tip of my soldering iron, it wasn't clean. So what you do is you kind of push this stuff in there and clean the tip of your soldering iron. And then you get one of these things. This is something else you have to have. It's like a Brillo pad in a little can. You just kind of, you push your soldering iron in there just to kind of get the extra stuff off of it. Now the tip of your soldering iron is nice and clean. This thing's going to work great. So tip tinner and cleaner. And you can buy that on Amazon all over the place. There's different companies to get it from. And then you want one of these little Brillo pad things. And I'll try to put some hyperlinks in the description of this video, show you different places to get all these things. And then finally, one of these guys is really handy. I think they call these helping hands. But it gives you a place to put your soldering iron where you hopefully won't burn yourself. And it also gives you a way to like grab a hold of wires and hold them together, kind of like a third set of hands while you're working. And if you need it, it has a magnifying glass on the top of it. I don't use this a whole lot. Usually just kind of gets in my way, but the older you get, the more you need stuff like that. And if you're looking at something really small, the magnifier is great. So that's it. What else? One last thing, you might want some heat shrink tubing, and you're going to need some way of warming the heat shrink tubing. So a heat gun works well, but for today I'm going to just use a open flame. And then, of course, you always want to be safe. So when you're soldering, keep a fire extinguisher somewhere close by in case you have a fire. So let's go ahead and solder something. Let's do this one first. Let's take the stranded wire, let's solder that. So what I'm going to do, just going to get 2 fresh ends here. That's probably what you're going to start out with. In fact, here, we'll do the whole thing. Let's just make it real simple. You have 2 wires, and you want to put them together. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to strip the ends. So I'm going to give myself, in this case, I'm going to give myself maybe about 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, right? So there's one end that's stripped. I'm going to strip this other end, right? So you have 2 wires, they're stripped, you want to join them together. Now in this case they're short, I can get at both ends, but normally it's not going to be like that. Normally you're going to have this wire, it goes off somewhere, it's hooked to something else. You're going to have this wire, it goes off somewhere, it's hooked to something else. What you want to do before you solder is cut yourself a little piece of heat shrink tubing, kind of like that, and you want to slide it over one of the wires, and you want to keep it a little some distance away from where you're soldering so you don't get heat to it. But that what'll be able to happen now is after you're done soldering, you'll be able to slide this heat shrink tubing over it and protect that connection. But so let's just pretend this wire goes off somewhere and that heat shrink tubing is there ready for us to go. So what you do in this case, this example, you can take these 2 wires and you just kind of like twist them together or something like this. And hopefully you do it good enough that the wires kind of hold themselves together. And in some cases, you're, like I said, you'll be working on a car, you'll be working in some situation, the wires will just kind of hold themselves there in place like that. Because of where I am at right now, I can't do that. So I'm going to use my helping hands. So I'm just going to come over here, I'm going to grab this thing, hold it just like that, and then I'm going to take my soldering iron, and then I'm going to use my solder. So what kind of solder am I using? I'm using 6040 rosin core solder, and it's 32 thou diameter solder. 6040 rosin core solder it's very important that it has the rosin core. If it needs to be, the rosin is like a flux, helps make things stick. Make sure you're buying solder that has the flux in it, the rosin core. If you get like solder that's meant for plumbing, it won't have that in it. You won't be able to solder. Also, the size of the solder, same thing. Little tiny diameter solder works great for small wires and small connectors. If you're soldering big things, you go with thicker wire. So what you do is you come down here, and hopefully you can zoom in and you can see this. And do you know how to zoom in? There you go. Perfect. So can you see it? All right. So what you do is you just you got to get some heat on the solder, you got to get some heat on the wire, and this is what you do. So if you don't get any heat into the wire, the solder won't stick to the wire. So you got to get them both warm. And now kind of see what we're doing there. And don't forget about the other side of the wire. So sometimes, you have to get the solder on the bottom too. And like I said, remember the wire is working like a heat sink. So as soon as you start putting the heat to it, the heat wants to disappear, and the heat is going to go down the wire. So it's kind of like a balancing act. You want to get enough solder, or you want to get enough heat on the wire to melt the solder and make it nice, but you don't want to get too much heat on it to melt the insulation. So that doesn't look too bad. We have a nice looking solder. Oh, no, I just messed it up. We have a nice looking solder joint. If you get too much solder on the tip of your iron, just, dip it in your Brillo pad thing here. That'll help get the extra solder off the tip of the iron. Try to avoid flicking the soldering iron. If you find you have too much solder on the tip of your soldering iron, don't flick it, because what'll happen, the solder is going to go everywhere. The worst case scenario, it's going to go in your eyes or the eyes of someone else. So don't flick your soldering iron. Do this to get the extra solder off. Okay, so we just look at this for a second. So you can see we have a nice soldering joint. We've put those wires together. They are connected. They are as strong as they can be. Mine have actually used a little bit more solder than we need, but those two wires are connected. So the next thing you need to do is you just want to cover it up with your heat shrink tubing, and then carefully, a heat gun might be best for this, but I'm going to use an open flame. You just kind of carefully put some heat to it to get that heat shrink tubing to shrink. And if you get too close to it, you're going to burn it. So you just want to carefully put a little heat on there. And that's it. So now you have a nice connection. It's strong. You have some heat shrink tubing over it to protect it. You have two wires soldered together. That's a real typical situation. You do that a lot maybe in automotive applications or in your DIY CNC applications. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is with the solid core wires. So slightly different technique in this situation. So we start out the same way. You gotta snip the end of your wires. This one's already right. Sometimes if you're dealing with really old wires, the first few millimeters of the wire might get moisture in it. You'll see that if you're working on cars or boat trailers or something. The first few millimeters of the wire might get moisture in it and it's really dirty. So just, if it looks like that, clip it back. Get that dirty, corroded metal out of there. Go back until you get some nice clean wire. Same thing, going to strip. Going to strip. So I have two exposed ends, and we're going to simulate the heat shrink thing too, so let's just cut a little piece of heat shrink. So you have your two wires. Let's just pretend the green one is where we're going to start. So slide your heat shrink tubing over the wire, and I'll just bend the end of that there so it can't fall off.
That's blue.
Looks green to me. I don't know. Looks green. That's blue. This is, I don't know. Humor me. I think that's green. I think that's blue. So I'm calling that green. Green, red. So same thing. You want to get your, try not to burn yourself. Get your wire down here, and you could kind of do the same thing in this application. You could bring these wires together and twist them, but I'm going to do something a little different with these. First, I got to put my helping hand back together here. So sometimes you won't be able to twist things together. Sometimes you're going to take a wire and you're going to lay it against a metal terminal and solder it to the terminal. So you have to have a slightly different technique. So that's what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to pre-tin these wires. I'm going to take my solder, and what I'm going to do, you can zoom in and see this. Let me know when you're zoomed in. Okay. What you're going to do is you're going to pre-tin your wire. You're going to just coat the wire with solder. Both sides. Because solder wants to stick to solder for sure. And you don't need a lot, but you want enough to make it work, right? So you've pre-tinned both wires. And I got a lot of extra solder on my soldering iron, so I'm going to get rid of that right there. Okay, that looks a little better. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave that red one there. I'm going to take the green one. You know, what I want to do is I want to get them to stick together, right? So this red wire, you know, sometimes you'll do the soldering two wires together. Other times this technique is when you're soldering a wire onto a connector. It's the same idea. So I'm going to carefully hold the green wire, and what I'm going to do is just get them next to each other, and I'm going to warm it up. Get that solder to jump across. I'm just going to hold it in place for a second, and now those two wires are soldered together. And let's just zoom in on it so you can see what that looks like. Nice connection. It's very strong. It's not going to come apart. And just like before, slide a little heat shrink tubing over it. Warm it up. There you go. You have a nice connection. So like I said, I like to work with solid core wire whenever possible. I feel like it's just a little easier to work with. You can do that same technique with the stranded wire. You can solder stranded wire like that as well. We'll just do it really quick here. Same thing. Take your stranded wire. Let's put one end here. Let's put the other end here, just for the sake of argument. Get out our solder, and we'll do the same thing. We're going to pre-tin. Now I'm in 15 watt right now. I have my soldering iron on 15 watts. I'm going to flick it over to 30 just to get a little more heat. All right, so we pre-tin. Come over here, we tin. This stuff's always harder to do after a couple cups of coffee. So I need to get enough heat into the wire to get the solder to stick to it. There we go. All right, we're pre-tinned. Then what I'm going to do is take this wire. Hopefully you can see this. And you just have to get enough heat into that to get them to stick. And if you do it right, the solder just kind of jumps across. So that looks pretty good. So there you go. There's another. Now you can see the way they stick together. It doesn't look quite as nice as when we twisted them, but they are soldered and they did stick together. Pretty strong. Matter of fact, it took a lot to break it. The soldering connection actually didn't break. It actually just ripped the wire right out of the insulation. So that gives you an idea of how strong a proper solder joint is. So there you go. I hope that was helpful. There is my version of how to solder. So thanks for watching. I hope this helps you with your projects, and be safe. So long.